How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne and this is PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation. Today we have two great topics to cover. The first one is that there's a new report out about Sony and how they lost a lot of market cap based on their financial reports from last weekend, but I looked into it a lot more and it's not nearly as bad as it sounds. And then the second story is that Sony is suffering from success when it comes to Helldivers 2. Before I jump into it, I am at 7,500 subscribers for this month. I just want to say thank you so much for that. I'd really love to push it to 8,000. So if you watch the channel and you're new here or you've been here for a while, check that you're subscribed and also have your notifications set to all. So let's just jump right into the first news story here, which is Sony's big problem that they're encountering right now. Look, we know that 2024, when it comes to Sony releases, it doesn't look like it's going to be too amazing. We have Helldivers 2 right now, which is absolutely phenomenal. By far one of the best games Sony has put out in years at this point. Like, honestly, it is one of my favorite PlayStation games of all time. We have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but that's third party. And then throughout the rest of the year, there's not really much we know about. We are supposed to hear about the Twisted Metal reboot soon. I'm not sure if that's going to come out this year or next year, but the point is 2024 is not looking too hot when it comes to Sony making money, which is not good, obviously, because they need to make money to sink money into games and then release games for the PlayStation 5. But once again, like I said in the intro of this video, I don't think things are nearly as bad as they seem. But let's just get into the numbers here. So after that investors call from Hiroki Totoki, where he went through basically the entire business of PlayStation before he takes over the brand for Jim Ryan, he said that their target for this fiscal year was 25 million PS5 sold, and they dropped that by around 4 million to 21 million units. And that makes sense when you consider like how few games are coming out. There's not a lot driving hype for the PlayStation 5. I don't really think that's bad at all. It's just an adjustment on their part, which is in the negative direction. So because of that, their share price dropped by around 8.4%, but then it stabilized and ended at around 6.5% of a drop by the end of the day. But because Sony has been doing so well ever since around 2020, that resulted in a $10 billion loss on their market cap, which, like, I don't think there's any good way to spin that. Thankfully, I'm not invested in Sony. I did not lose an insane amount of money by investing in Sony, which is great. But yeah, losing $10 billion off of your market cap is not great, especially on the heels of Microsoft announcing that they are now a $1 trillion company, right? Like, when you compare them, that's not really too good. There's not a lot of great optics there. The other problem they're facing is profit margin. So usually Sony can set their watch by their profit margins being around 13%. They've been able to just say, hey, we're usually looking at a 13% profit margin, which is pretty good. That's what they want. That's what they expect. That's what they want to see. But in 2022, that profit margin dropped to 9%, and now it's all the way down to 6%, which is not great. I mean, they made a profit, which is good, but like 6% is extremely marginal. And all this data is coming from a Jefferies analyst over at CNBC. It's not me doing the math or anything. Like, we're hearing this from a very legitimate source. And that analyst said, just like I did in last week's video, that problem that they're having where they're selling less consoles than they thought they would at this time, like they dropped to 21 million as their prediction for the end of this fiscal year, that's not as bad as the huge drop in profit margins that they're seeing. The analyst kept talking though, and this is where I really disagree with what they're saying. They said that the profit margin should have been around 20% for the last fiscal year based on a few factors. I'm just going to read the quote. They said there were various tailwinds that should have driven up the margins towards 20%, such as the increase in digital game sales, as well as Sony's PS Plus service, which has a margin of around 50%. So there's actually a couple reasons I have issues with what they're saying that we're going to get into here. I just don't think this person really knows what's going on in the PlayStation ecosystem. They're just reading numbers and not really understanding how things work within the gaming sphere of PlayStation. So the first thing they point out is that yes, digital sales did do better last year than they ever had before. I think it was like a 60-40 split in favor of digital sales, but what they're not accounting for when it comes to PlayStation Plus is that Sony dramatically raised the price of PS Plus across the board. So no matter whether you were subscribed to Essential, Extra, or Premium, you were paying more for PlayStation Plus, and unfortunately the increase in cost went up based on what tier you had. So it went up a little bit from like $60 to $70 or $80 in the Essential range, but it went up dramatically more when it came to Extra, and even more than that when it came to Premium. So because of that, we know that Sony lost a fair share of users of PlayStation Plus because they said, hey, I play a lot of single player games. Honestly, I don't get a lot of great quality out of the Essential games or even the Extra library because the hardcore users tend to show up day one and buy these games for $70. So while it is cool that you get stuff like Returnal, Ghost of Tsushima, and of course Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and even at a time Horizon Forbidden West, most of the people I would say who are subscribed to PlayStation Plus had already played the vast majority of those games by the time they were even added to the library. So you can kind of see why they saw a fall off with PlayStation Plus, and that's not being taken into account here, right? The second issue I have with what this analyst is saying really comes down to release strategy. I'm just going to read you some of the first party games that came out in 2022 and 2023, and now we're in 2024. So in 2022, we had a lot of PS5 first party titles, and I'm not counting third party exclusives like, for example, Ghostwire Tokyo that released in 2022, but I'm not even going to count that here because I think you'll see the vast difference. So when it comes to first party releases in 2022, we had The Last of Us Part 1, we had Horizon Forbidden West, we had Gran Turismo 7, and then at the end of the year, we had God of War Ragnarok. We even also had a very big indie release with Stray. And then in 2023, we got Horizon Forbidden West's expansion Burning Shores, we got the Call of the Mountain game for PSVR 2, but I'm not really counting that. And then we also got Humanity, which was an indie game that was once again on PS Plus Extra, so I'm assuming they didn't get much revenue there. And the only big release from Sony in 2023 was, of course, Spider-Man 2. And you also have to consider that in 2022, the third-party output was absolutely insane with the game Elden Ring. That sold by far the most copies on PS4 and PS5, so that definitely juiced up the revenue in terms of what Sony was making in that fiscal year. And then the only third-party release that I think is worth mentioning in 2022 is Elden Ring, mainly because all the marketing was for PlayStation, PS4, and PS5. Sony also made an investment into the developer From Software, and the investment was big enough where they could take that money and buy the Elden Ring IP back from Bandai Namco. So they own the IP of Elden Ring, which is really big for them. But that game sold so many copies just in general, but the vast majority of those copies were sold on PlayStation in 2022. The other thing you have to consider is that all of those big games that came out in 2022, like Forbidden West, like Gran Turismo 7, not The Last of Us Part 1, but God of War Ragnarok, they also all released on the PlayStation 4 as well. So I'm assuming that the sales were dramatically higher for those games, including that audience, in addition to the PS5 audience. And the games that released in 2023, whether you're talking the Burning Shores expansion or even stuff like Spider-Man 2, those were only released on PS5. And while the PS5 has sold pretty well since it came out, the user base is nowhere near what it is on the PlayStation 4 when you're talking PlayStation 5, mainly because the PS5 has not been out long enough. There was also that whole situation where they just couldn't make enough PS5s when the thing came out, so they didn't sell nearly as fast or as well as the PlayStation 4. So there's just not the user base there. So when you take into account that and the fact that they only released one big AAA first party game in 2023, I don't think it's that big of a deal that their operating profit margin, or whatever you want to call it, was dramatically lower in that year, because if there's not first party games driving game sales on the PlayStation ecosystem, you're not going to see a huge profit, right? And like I mentioned, Elden Ring also sold on PS4, and I'm assuming that it sold quite a lot of copies there because the best way to play Elden Ring, bar none, was to just run the PS4 version on your PlayStation 5. The PS5 version had some graphical enhancements and stuff like that, and it ran at a higher resolution, but the trade-off there was you got stuttering and big frame drops, but you had virtually none of those if you just played the PlayStation 4 version on your PlayStation 5. Now, yes, if you bought the PS5 version of Elden Ring, you also got the PS4 version for free, but I'm assuming that a lot of people just went out and didn't know any better and bought the PS4 disc as well. Now that spells a troubling outlook for 2024 because the only first party game we've gotten in 2024 is The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, which I'm assuming the vast majority of the copies sold for that game were just the $10 upgrade from the PS4 version that a lot of people already had. Now I, because I'm a sucker, bought the disc version for PS5 so I could put The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 next to each other on my shelf because the art connects, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it's safe to assume that the vast majority of people aren't psycho like me and didn't do that, and they probably just paid for the $10 upgrade. I didn't mention Helldivers 2 as first party because it's not first party. Second party is what it is because Arrowhead is not owned by Sony. So while yes, Sony funded the game, Sony's making a lot of money on every sale of the game, they don't own Arrowhead Studios, and while they might have some stake or full ownership of the Helldivers IP, it's not a first party game. And beyond that Twisted Metal reboot that's supposed to be announced to maybe come out this year, we have no idea what Sony's releasing in 2024, and they did confirm in that call that we're not going to see any big sequels from them, right? We're not going to see a new God of War, we're not going to see a new Uncharted, we're not going to see a new Last of Us or anything like that. The only thing we know of that's coming from the first party for the rest of the year pretty much is the two games, Fair Games and Concord, and both of those very well could be delayed. We do have third-party exclusives like Rise of the Ronin and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I'm sure there's going to be more as the year goes on. But when you compare 2023 and 2024, I'd say 2024 is even worse for Sony in terms of release strategy, and we could see that operating margin drop by even more. Now, there definitely is fair criticism to levy at Sony here when it comes to their budgets. We saw that the budgets are just completely out of control. We saw from the Insomniac leaks that, yes, the budget for Spider-Man 2 ended up being around $300 million, but the even worse part of that story is that they went $50 million over budget. I think $250 million is way too much for what game we got, especially considering they basically reused the entire map from the first game and just added onto it. They had all the combat laid out from the original game and then the Miles Morales game. They did add some traversal mechanics like the web wings. They added in some new skills and everything like that, but the vast majority of what was in the game was not created from scratch for that game. It was stuff that they brought up from the original Spider-Man release. So when you take that into account, it doesn't really make a lot of sense why the budget went so out of whack. And Hiroki Totoki also said that they just don't understand at a lot of the studios the business side of things. Like, they just want to make the best game possible, so they'll sink endless amounts of money into it to make sure it's as good and as bloated, I guess, as it can possibly be. So I think as time goes on, we're going to see a lot more focus from Sony when it comes to making their games, because this new game that's a smash hit, Helldivers 2, is the most focused game they've released since like the PS3 generation, and there's definitely something to learn there. That's good. When you just focus on making a fun game instead of making a game that looks expensive on the screen, people tend to turn up a lot more for it than they would otherwise. And they only had to sell that game for $40, which I'm sure helped in terms of making a huge profit on it. To wrap this story up though, one thing that I also take issue with when it comes to what this analyst was saying is that 2025, if all the rumors are to be believed, is going to be one of the greatest years ever for the PlayStation brand as a whole. We're probably going to see the new game from Bend Studios. We're going to see the new game from Santa Monica Studio. It's not going to be a God of War sequel. It's going to be a new IP from Cory Barlog that he started working on when God of War 2018 shipped. We're definitely going to see Ghost of Tsushima 2, the Twisted Metal reboot. If it slips out of 2024, that will come out in 2025 as well. There's supposed to be a new Astrobot game, maybe coming this year, but it could get pushed to next year. There's a ton of games coming in 2025, which makes a lot of sense if you look at the release schedule of the PS3 and PS4. Even though it's in the back half of its life cycle in terms of being a console, all the best games from Sony always come out towards the tail end of the generation. And I didn't even mention The Last of Us Part 3 or the new IP that Naughty Dog is working on. So all of those games are probably coming out in 2025, and then in 2026, they're going to have enough PS5s out there. And if the games live up to the quality standard that's been set by Sony in the past few generations, I don't think we have anything to worry about in terms of Sony going away. That brings us to our second news story though, where Sony is definitely suffering from success, because I'm sure if you tried to log into Helldivers 2 over the weekend, you were met with that screen that said servers were at capacity. Now, I quickly realized two tricks there that I'm going to tell you. I'm going to ruin them for myself. The first one is, if it's basically a queue system, it's not that the servers are at capacity. If you let that timer that shows up run out completely, it'll put you in the game after waiting about a minute. So a lot of people, I'm assuming, are just seeing that timer and quitting the game and coming back later. Just let the timer run out and you'll definitely get into the game within a few minutes. The second trick is even better. So I only tried this on PC because unfortunately I have to play there until they activate cross save, which is super annoying. I thought it was going to be there at launch, but the PlayStation blog lied. So my PS5 save is stuck at like level 5 while my PC save is all the way up at level 21. And I basically have almost everything unlocked. But long story short, if you're on the dashboard or your desktop and your friend invites you to the game, you can join the game from that invite and it'll skip right past that queue screen and just launch you right into their ship. That has worked every single time for me. I have never seen a queue, a servers at capacity warning, or anything like that. That has been my most foolproof way to get into the game, which I'm assuming everyone is going to want to take advantage of, because you want to play this game with friends. I know quick play is there, but you need to use voice chat in this game once you get to the higher difficulties. So yeah, you're going to have to play with friends. But yeah, just in terms of raw numbers, this game is one of Sony's biggest hits ever. They beat Halo Infinite, they beat Grand Theft Auto 5 in terms of players on PC at a concurrent level. I think they hit over 400,000 players playing the game at the same time over the weekend. I saw people saying that it's like 20-1 in terms of people buying it on PC versus PlayStation 5s. I just don't think people are taking into account that there are way more PlayStation 5s out there than there are gaming PCs that people are playing this game on, so I'm assuming that a lot of copies were also sold on the PlayStation 5 as well. Arrowhead basically created a perfect storm where, because people couldn't get into the game during the launch weekend, they activated a double XP weekend this weekend, but the game's hype level reached its maximum this weekend. So many people are trying to get on in combination just to play the game and also to get that double XP that they hit the cap very quickly. So I'm assuming we'll get even more rewards as time goes on. They said that they increased the server size to around 500,000 people being allowed in, and they're still hitting the limit. So yeah, I'm assuming that the server size is just going to continue to increase, and we'll see this problem dissipate as time goes on. The last thing I want to mention with Helldivers 2 is that there are Twitch drops enabled. It's really finicky. They only allow them through a few Twitch streamers, but basically if you go to Twitch and search for Helldivers 2 and then filter it to do drops enabled, you can just leave a stream on with the volume off for an hour and you'll get some pretty cool kind of Halo inspired armor within the game. So yeah, when it comes to Helldivers 2, I could not be happier that this game is popping off. As a diehard OG Helldivers fan, I played it on my PS3, my PS4, and my Vita back in the day. I loved that game, but I love this one even more. It's one of the best games I've ever played, and I'm absolutely obsessed with it. I changed my phone wallpaper to this sweet propaganda poster I found on TikTok. I got an official like 4K wallpaper for my PC, and I filtered it red. I'll put it in the description on like an Imgur link if you want to grab it. But yeah, this game is awesome. If you haven't picked it up yet, I highly recommend playing it. And I don't think we're going to run out of people to play with for a very long time. But that's all I've got for you today. Make sure you let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.